Major breaking news. The Trump administration continues to push forward with the Second Amendment. Specifically, according to reports today by the New York Times, the restoration of Second Amendment rights has begun, including the restoration of gun rights to actor Mel Gibson. Let's break it down when we come back. Good news out there in America. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4 Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, so this is great news. The New York Times is now reporting breathlessly. That's the New York Times, as per usual. Is breathlessly reporting that Mel Gibson and many other Americans are now or have getting their gun rights back. Specifically, they're basically saying this has occurred. It hasn't been published yet, hasn't been made available yet to the public, but it has occurred according to this article by the New York Times entitled Mel Gibson's Gun Rights to be Restored by the Justice Department. Now, before we get into the details of this particular story, I want to give you some historical context because, again, you turn into this channel to kind of get the big picture, to get sort of the geeky details of some of the stuff and to put it all into perspective. I just want to show you and illustrate just how fast the Trump administration is moving on various issues, including the Second Amendment. Of course, we know all these other issues he's working on, like closing the border and protecting America from China and Russia and other enemies, is all going on at breakneck speed. We also know his attempt to clean out the deep state with all those massive lawsuits is all going on. And a lot of the same people, I suspect, in the White House counsel's office and the various Department of Justice offices that have to fight with these deep state judges who are threatening, in some instances, to hold them in contempt of court, are the same lawyers that have to be dealing with the Second Amendment and pushing forward, which goes back to a point that I've made repeatedly, that one of the purposes of those lawsuits against the Trump administration in, for example, the District of Columbia, and all those judges that are trying to enjoin Trump and delay Trump and force him to litigate 1,000 times over, is all about taking the most valuable commodity away from President Trump, and that is time. Every day that these Department of Justice lawyers, these Office of Legal Counsel lawyers, these White House counsel lawyers for the Trump administration are bogged down dealing with these crazy lawsuits brought by basically deep state actors against the Trump administration, is another hour or another day that they cannot be devoted to other parts of the Trump agenda, including, for example, advancing the Second Amendment. Now, with that said, there's tremendous progress already being made on the Second Amendment, and today's story out of the New York Times illustrates the point where they're basically reporting that a decision has been made that Mel Gibson would be among the first group of people with criminal convictions to get their Second Amendment rights back. Now, I also want to remind you one additional thing in terms of timing. I want to compare the Trump administration with the George W. Bush administration. And when it comes to the Second Amendment, George W. Bush was relatively okay. We don't have to talk about the problems with law and order conservatives. I do think there is a distinction historically. We know that the Democrats are always bad on guns until you go back to JFK in the 1960s. That was a different era. But post-1968, the Democrats have always been terrible on guns. They want to disarm you and turn you into a serf and a slave and not a citizen. We know that. But when it comes to the Republicans, a lot of people in the Second Amendment community will tell you, and I will agree with this, we also often have problems with the so-called law and order conservatives that somehow equate, and I think, by the way, Judge Harvey Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, who's like 90 years of age, and I've made a lot of fun of him over the years, and you've heard me, and I stand by those comments and criticisms of Judge Harvey Wilkinson, who, again, is like 90 years old now and does a terrible job on the Second Amendment. Terrible, terrible job. But with that said, we've talked about people like that are historically been known as law and order conservatives. Now, historically, the problem with law and order conservatives is that when it comes to gun rights and the Second Amendment, when they think about the Second Amendment and guns, they want the good guys to have the guns, but they define the good guys as police, as law enforcement. So they're perfectly content to have the DEA, the FBI, local law enforcement have all these guns, But they view that anything that interferes with local law enforcement and guns in the hands of government, like the military, is an inconvenience. And thus, as a general matter, they don't like it when you and I carry guns, or you and I have guns, and you and I have Second Amendment rights. Most law and order conservatives historically have viewed gun rights as being, let the police have the guns to protect us from the bad criminals. Now, this is all changing because the Donald Trump administration has a much more libertarian view of this. I believe they did that in 2016, and I think it's much more so even now. So what we're starting to see is great movement here. Now, I want, again, the reason why I bring up the George W. Bush and the law and order conservatives is because you need to understand that context to understand just how strong the Trump administration is, and I think will continue to be on the Second Amendment. George W. Bush was a relatively good character when it comes to our Second Amendment rights in the grand scheme of things, especially when you compare him to other law and order conservatives. But there's really only three things, in my opinion. You can disagree with me. There's some debate about this, but I think there's three big things that George W. Bush's administration did in that period of 8 years when he was the president, involving the Second Amendment. And I would say the three big things he did, and you can push back on me some of these issues involving the ATF and some of the technicalities, that's fine. But the three big things from the Second Amendment point of view is, I believe in 2004, George W. Bush's Office of Legal Counsel came out with a very powerful 100-plus page memo explaining that they believed that the right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, was in fact an individual right, and that Office of Legal Counsel paper in 2004 was very helpful for ultimately the 2008 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in Heller that says that the Second Amendment does indeed protect an individual right. So the two things right there is that George W. Bush did it. His Office of Legal Counsel had a very favorable position on the Second Amendment as of 2004, and then in 2008 we won the Heller case by the Supreme Court. That was during the George W. Bush term with some George W. Bush appointees. The other thing he did, the third thing I would say that was very powerful, is in 2005, and this goes back to the law and order conservative thing. In 2005, George W. Bush signed into law the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which was really a protection for the gun industry, and it was appropriate. But in doing so, he relied heavily on the support of the government law enforcement community. There were letters to Congress by the military, the Pentagon, saying, we need a domestic arms industry to arm our soldiers. There's also letters in support from law enforcement to say that, we can't be buying our guns for NYPD from the Chinese. That's not secure. And of course, this all occurred after 9/11. So I only point this out to say, in a period of an 8-year administration, and this is the one takeaway you need to take away from this before we compare this to Donald Trump right now. In the 8 years of George W. Bush as a Republican president, in my view, there was three big things. The 2004 Office of Legal Counsel memo that like 5 people out there have actually read, other than the Supreme Court and Mark Smith, and that said the Second Amendment protected individual rights, the Protection and Lawful Commerce Act in 2005, and ultimately the Supreme Court's decision in 2008 in Heller, which is a big deal. That was three things in a period of 8 years. Hear what I just said? 8 years. And then the time period between Heller and Bruin was 14 years, 2008 through 2022, right? Now, the reason why I want you to understand that historical context, the glacial pace at which advancing our Second Amendment rights has often taken place at the federal level with these administrations, I want you to be able to understand that because it will help you compare the historical slow pace at which our right to keep and bear arms was protected by prior Republican presidents with the Trump administration that has already taken a series of steps in favor of the Second Amendment. And the most recent one that's you could see the effect of it, it's actually happening, is according to this New York Times article, the fact that they're literally starting to give Second Amendment rights back to American citizens who were convicted of so-called criminal convictions. And again, I'm always sort of skeptical about some of these criminal convictions, having been a lawyer for a long time and tried a lot of cases. I know how games can get played with some of these prosecutions, and a lot of people, frankly, roll over and plead guilty to some nonsense because they either can't afford lawyers, it's such a distraction to their lives, or there's some other reason for doing so. And, like I said, a lot of these convictions in my experience, and I'm a order liberty guy. I'm like generally pro-police. I'm not really pro-criminal at all or anything like that. But I can just tell you the process in the legal system is not that smooth, and a lot of people that probably didn't do it and probably did nothing wrong do get swept up and have to plead guilty to stuff for a bunch of reasons, which is not according to Hoyle, from my point of view. Nevertheless, I think it's great news here that the Trump administration already in the first 90 days has not only come out with an executive order on the Second Amendment, is not only paused litigations involving the Second Amendment, say we're going to reassess certain things, is now literally in the process of restoring Second Amendment rights. And the reason why this is a big deal is, here's the key. In 1992, remember, there's a law on the books. There's a restoration of rights law on the books, according to the regulations that the ATF controls, that allows people to go through a process to get their rights restored. But that process, according to under the ATF, has not been funded by Congress since I think like 1992 or something like that. That means for like decades, even if you had a basis for restoring your Second Amendment rights, there was no methodology to do so, no process to do it, because the office at ATF was specifically defunded by the Congress. Makes you wonder why the way Congress cannot defund NPR and defund PBS and some of this other nonsense. They're able to defund the restoration of Second Amendment rights very clearly and succinctly for decades, but they're not capable of defunding all this USAID nonsense. But again, I digress. So the point is that Trump has moved that restoration of rights process away from the ATF pursuant to kind of an interim order that's in the process of being effectuated and fully enforced, and move that away. And of course, you know, the continuing resolution budget process, which we talked about previously, the way they moved money from the ATF to the Department of Justice generally. All of that means that the ATF is no longer going to be the source of restoring rights. They're moving it to the main justice officials, and that's good because the main justice officials have not been defunded like the ATF has when it comes to the restoration of rights. And now we're starting to see the effect of these pro-Second Amendment policies literally in the first 90 days of this administration. And again, can compare it to like the George W. Bush administration, never mind the others, how long it takes to do some of this stuff. This is the breakneck speed that Donald Trump is moving, not in addition to things like firing the counsel for the ATF, hiring a Second Amendment supporter for the ATF counsel position, getting John Sauer out of the state of Missouri, a great lawyer who's good on the Second Amendment, confirmed as the Solicitor General, getting Harmeet Dillon, who's great on the Second Amendment, handles Second Amendment cases, to be in charge of the Office of Civil Rights, and she was just confirmed last night, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of great stuff happening here, but this New York Times story saying that the firing of the pardon counsel because she would not sign off on this on the approval of restoring Second Amendment rights for, among others, Mel Gibson, and the fact that Mel Gibson and many others are already, apparently according to this report, getting their gun rights back right now in the first 3 months of the Trump administration, I think bodes well for what the next 3.9 years is going to look like when it comes to our Second Amendment rights. There's a lot of work to be done out there. I think a lot of work will get done, and the fact that they're trying to bog down the lawyers to stop the Trump agenda in court is in some ways a good sign, because it knows that the deep state and the people that don't like, for example, the Second Amendment, are scared to death that Trump is going to do exactly what he said he's going to do. And obviously we see he's doing that with things like the tariffs and his economic policy, which we may even talk about over the weekend if you guys are curious. So there you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed today's show, but I think this is all a great sign for us. I think a lot of good stuff is coming. I think it's already starting to come, and if you're Mel Gibson and part of this first tranche of people getting your Second Amendment rights back, the good news has occurred already. So there you have it. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxes. Don't forget to subscribe to YouTube and Rumble, and I look forward to talking to you again really soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.